Nicholas Danforth and Amberin Zaman. Welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Likewise.
This is a first time for both you guys.
It is.
Yeah. Well, you're welcome. You both write about Turkish politics, which is why we're here. Nicholas, you're the editor at War on the Rocks, so you end up editing a lot of articles and stories dealing with all sorts of geopolitical issues, and you guys have really blown up in the last year. No pun intended, with everything that's been going on in Ukraine and between Russia and Ukraine. But before we get into any of this conversation today, which is going to be primarily about Turkey, I would love for each of you to introduce yourselves. Amberin, why don't you go first? Tell us a little bit about who you are, how you got to doing what you do, and what do you do?
Sure. So my name is Amberin Zaman. I'm based in London. I'm originally from Turkey, and I'm a senior correspondent for Al Monitor. That's a Washington, D.C. based online news organization, which is relatively young. And we cover the Middle East and North Africa in depth. And what I do for Al Monitor is I travel across the Middle East and dig up stories and report from, places like Syria, Iraq, Tunisia, Israel, and write mainly about politics. And before that, I used to be The Economist's Turkey correspondent for a very long time. And before that, used to write for the Washington Post, LA Times, VOA. I was a stringer for all of those publications in Turkey.
So you've seen a lot of changes, not just in Turkey, but in the Middle East over the last 20 years. Nicholas, what about you? What's your deal? How did you get into this line of work?
I started off writing a PhD about U.S.-Turkish relations in the 1940s and 50s. That was the period of time that that Turkey became a democracy, that Turkey became a NATO ally. I started my research on it back in the late 2000s, and I didn't fully realize that by the time I finished, both of those features of Turkey would be kind of up for grabs in a way that I didn't really anticipate. Then after I finished my PhD, I switched to doing think tank work in Washington. I've covered U.S.-Turkish relations in sickness and in health, mostly in increasing sickness for a range of different think tanks. And then switched to editing at War on the Rocks, where I've been delighted to get to still work on Turkey, but also a host of other issues, including, as you said, a lot of stuff on Russia and Ukraine in the past year, and still enjoy the opportunity to talk about Turkey when it comes up.
So I was telling you guys before we started that one of the things that I find kind of both surprising, because it's such an opportunity, and frustrating is the lack of context that exists in the broader media ecosystem around the subject of Turkey. It's similar to how the press talked about MBS. They kind of get obsessed about certain personality types. Turkey has Erdogan. He's a big populist guy. That's a through line also to America's rise in populism and Trump, et cetera. And what I think gets lost is the answer to the question, why should I care, for the average American or even European that's watching. It's less true for Europe. I understand, I'm actually recording this episode from Greece. I'm a Greek citizen, and it's obviously relevant to Greece. But if you are sitting in the United States, why should you care about the recent elections in Turkey and what happens to the country overall? Amberin, why don't you take that question first, and then Nicholas can give his take on it.
Well, my answer will be more of a boilerplate one. All you need to do really is to look at the map to realize why Turkey matters. It's sitting on prime strategic real estate at the intersection of Europe, the Middle East, the Caucasus, the Aegean, the Eastern Mediterranean. Turkey matters in so many different ways, and of course, most immediately now we're seeing that play out in the Ukraine conflict, where the position Turkey takes is of critical importance. And so thanks to Turkey, for example, we have this Black Sea grain deal that allows Ukraine to continue to export its wheat and therefore to head off a global food crisis, for example. What Turkey does in places like Syria, in Iraq, in the Caucasus, actually changes the course of history. We just saw that happen in like a couple of years ago in Armenia, when after like 30 years, suddenly, within the course of 2 months, Turkey's military assistance to Azerbaijan completely altered the calculus there, where Azerbaijan was able to reclaim all its occupied territories and is now, in fact, trying to get more from Armenia. And obviously, why should the United States care? Because Turkey is a major NATO ally. And we've seen this NATO ally now playing with Russia. You could say growing closer to it, depends on how you look at things. But obviously much more involved with Russia. There's obviously a kind of bro thing going on between Putin and Erdogan. And we saw Putin, step up to the plate for Erdogan ahead of these elections by deferring Turkey's debt for natural gas that it imports in very large quantities from Russia, for example, by injecting billions of dollars in cash to the Turkish central bank, helping to prop up the lira. And of course, the United States obviously cares that Turkey is developing this very sort of this deep, increasingly deep relationship with Russia. It's always about not wanting to lose Turkey. Nicholas may have a different view on that. Perhaps people in Washington care less about losing Turkey and have different plans. But I think that at the end of the day, Turkey has always historically been, in various different iterations, an extremely important country, and for as long as there's no great tectonic shift and Turkey remains where it is physically, it will continue to play a very important role. And one last point, obviously for Europe too, Turkey is holding the floodgates for millions of refugees that Europe doesn't want in within its own borders.
So, Nicholas, I'd love for you to respond as well, but please also address Amberin's point about losing Turkey. What does that mean, losing Turkey?
Well, I'd say it's a tribute to how much Turkey matters geopolitically, that whatever incarnation of U.S.-Turkish relations we're going through, whatever is happening in Turkey's domestic politics, there always is a strong interest in Turkey in Washington. It's something that certainly struck me writing about the country over the last 2 decades. I agree with you right now that narrative is very much focused on Erdogan's populism, on what that means for the world. But the fact is, at every stage, and I can talk about this going back to the 1950s if we want, there's been editors, politicians, folks watching the world from Washington have had one reason or another to focus on Turkey. One way or another, Turkey has been at the center of a lot of narratives and a lot of debates that we're trying to have in Washington. So again, in the early 2000s, when people were much more optimistic about what was happening in Turkey, when Turkish EU accession was on the table, when Turkish democratization really seemed like a real prospect, that was important to people here, again, for the very concrete geopolitical reasons that Amberin outlined, but also because in the aftermath of 9/11, the question of, a predominantly Muslim country that was a close U.S. ally was of crucial importance to people. The question of democratization in Turkey, at the end of the Cold War, when you had this moment where you really thought that liberal values were going to spread across the world, when U.S. policy really hinged on, taking this liberal international order that we've been trying to create and had been stifled for the course of the Cold War and expanding that into something truly global, Turkey's democratization, Turkey's ability to go from a country that was seen as a very incomplete or problematic democracy to a real entrenched European-style democracy, was in a lot of ways, and I think quite rightfully, at the heart of the discussion of whether or not, that vision for a more liberal democratic world could take hold. And unfortunately, I think as that vision has faltered around the world, and it certainly has faltered in Turkey, the flip side of that, people were analyzing the country from an optimistic lens. Now, as you said, it's the story of populism, it's the story of nationalism, it's the story of religion, and it's Erdogan's ability to channel all those things and turn those things against the West that's become, on an ideological level, central to this question of whether democracy can expand, but also at a political level, these debates about whether or not what we're going to see or what we were going to see was a kind of U.S.-dominated liberal international order expanding across the world or whether we're going to see increasing pushback to that, whether we're going to see more and more countries that didn't envision themselves as part of that world joining forces to push back against it. And that's, to get to your question about losing Turkey, I think why these debates have such resonance right now. It's, it's not just the practical side of Turkey's cooperation with Russia as it relates to Ukraine, although clearly that's huge, but the bigger question of, is a country that's been a NATO ally for 70 years going to stay one? Is this configuration something that's going to last and deepen, or is it going to be thrown in reverse? And there are clearly a lot of people in Turkey who do want to throw that in reverse. Erdogan most prominently, but also, both his allies and opponents. And so it's, for very specific but also much broader reasons, a question that, understandably, I think folks in DC are very focused on.
Yeah, I love how both of you guys addressed that, because Amberin focused more on the geostrategic element, which is where Turkey is located and why it's always been an important geopolitical foothold, either because of its role as a gateway in the trading empires, or the Middle East and the need for the ability to fly over Turkey. It's been an important and its role as a gateway to Europe. But also, I think this other framing of like autarky or authoritarianism versus democracy is a really interesting one, because, and also East versus West, because Turkey kind of straddles both worlds, but it's had a more Western orientation since the time of Kemal Ataturk. And so I guess there is a kind of, so is it correct? Let me ask it this way. Is this question of losing Turkey less about whether or not Turkey will remain a sort of compliant ally of the United States, because that seems to be less and less true? Turkey seems to want to exercise strategic autonomy, whether it's in its dealings with the US or with the United States. But is it less about that, and is it more about where it would fall ideologically, so that in this new world that's coming together, we can work with the Turks on shared interests, but what we worry about more is whether we'll be able to work with them on shared values? Is that really the right way to think about it, guys?
I don't think so, no. I'm profoundly cynical about the way the United States approaches Turkey, and any other country for that matter, very much narrowly defined by how it perceives its own national interest. And I think that's played out for decades. If the United States were so concerned about values, why the hell was it saying nothing when, the Turkish army was burning its way through southeast Turkey, razing villages to the ground, feeding Kurdish villagers their own excrement, and where were the values then? As I said, I think I tend to go with your first argument, which is that it essentially, the United States is worried that it's losing leverage over Turkey, that yes, it is less and less able to have Turkey align with its own policies. And I mean, this, we already saw that quite distinctly during the occupation of Iraq, when the United States wanted to send troops through Turkey to Iraq, and Erdogan was game, but then his party wasn't, and that whole thing sort of fell through. But earlier you could cite Cyprus as an example, where admittedly it was a left-wing government that went against US policies. But I think this is, as Turkey flexes its muscles and finds, it becomes more confident, and it certainly has grown extremely confident under Erdogan, it's going to be less and less easy for the US to get Turkey to do its bidding, to put it very crudely. But equally, I think it's also to do with the fact that the Europeans have forfeited quite a bit of leverage as well, particularly when it comes to human rights and democracy, because they've been profoundly hypocritical in their approach to Turkey, starting full membership talks with them only to have Merkel and Sarkozy announce the next day practically that, well, by the way, guys, you're never going to be members of the EU because you're too large, you're too Muslim. And also now it's just sort of purely transactional, where the European Union gives Turkey lots of cash in exchange for keeping all these sort of unsightly, quote unquote, brown Muslim and other people they don't want within their borders. So, okay, Erdogan is can be quite awful, but then, who is our moral compass? Which country today?
Nicholas, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, what I'd add is that when things were going well and for Turkey and for the US-Turkish relationship, it was always a very nice example for people to point to of all our values and interests lining up. That here was a country that had become culturally pro-Western, that was secular, that at the same time was a US ally within NATO, and was also democratic. And so it was convenient for everyone, I think, who wanted to see or who believed in this kind of idealistic version of US foreign policy, uh, doing well by doing good around the world, to have Turkey as an example of all the things we liked lining up, pro-Western, democratic, pro-American in a geopolitical sense. And, in moments that worked, but when you start looking at, the specifics, again, for the last century, they never quite line up as well as people wanted them to. And as Amberin pointed out, sometimes they quite dramatically diverge. My research was on the 1950s when Turkey joined NATO. And one of the really popular assumptions that's come out of that, Turkey joined NATO and it became a democracy at the same time. And now that looked good for everyone. And so it was very easy for people to say, and people in Turkey and in the United States, that was a precondition for joining NATO. The United States put pressure on Turkey to democratize in order to join NATO. And when you dig into the details, that's not what happened. The United States made it quite clear that Turkey could go on being an authoritarian government. It could join NATO because we needed them against the Soviets. 1948, Portugal, under the quasi-fascist Salazar government, joined NATO. People in Turkey realized that they knew they didn't have to democratize to get the benefits of a U.S. alliance. They did for their own reasons. We can talk about that. I think that's a real credit to the people who were in the Turkish government at the time. But that was convenient. At the same time, right, in the 1980, Turkey had a brutal military coup. It remained very loyal to NATO, and as a result, the United States didn't really have any issue with the lack of democracy. And as it comes to secularism, pro-Western values, you were talking about MBS earlier. Saudi Arabia has never been a particularly secular country. Quite the opposite. Never been an issue for U.S.
Well,
the U.S.
so
government. So it's
sorry,
yeah.
I was going to say, because I wanted to clarify a little bit when I talked about shared values. I draw a distinction between America today versus America for most of its post World War II history. America has become increasingly a crusader nation. And so it does feel like the values, the quote values of the US system, play a larger role in greasing the wheels of international diplomacy or halting the process than they used to. Certainly, the shale boom enabled the U.S. to be tougher on Saudi Arabia, but they didn't necessarily need to be so hung up on those differences in values between the U.S. and the Saudis. It feels increasingly like the values conversation exposes some kind of insecurity about the larger sort of American empire, the neoliberal rules based order, than otherwise. That was kind of where I was going, but I don't know if either of you agree with that, and if you can let me know, and then we can kind of move to the electoral part of the conversation. Does that resonate at all? That it's a different foreign policy sort of perspective that the U.S. has today than it did during during the Cold War and most of its post World War II period.
I'd be inclined to say that for most of, as I said, I go back to World War II looking at this, there's always been a tension between the US's very idealistic values and the way, the opportunistic way it's often engaged with the world. That's, I don't think, surprising. I think some people see that as fine. Some people are very outraged about it. That's that tension has been consistent. And I mean, I do think we're in a cycle, particularly after the Trump presidency, where there was, Biden coming in did put much more of an emphasis on values. And, Saudi Arabia became a good example of that. It was somewhere where, in this constant tension, in this kind of constant, balancing act between values, nominal values, and actual interests, I guess what I'd say is it seemed like Trump swung, because he swung so hard towards a cold embrace of interests. There was a little bit of a reaction. There was more of a push for, people to say in a very kind of emphatic way, no, we have to stand up for values. And again, I think because Saudi Arabia was such a nice example, a lot of people on the Democratic side focused on that. But at the end of the day, Biden hasn't, we're not embargoing Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, but we pissed off MBS pretty bad. Go ahead, Amber, and then we'll move to the election.
Speaking to what you said about the sort of crusading side of things, absolutely, wasn't that what the whole occupation of Iraq was about? But it also,
I think it was. I think that I would view the. I mean, I always view the democracy signaling in a more cynical way ahead of that invasion than I do today. I feel like somehow today the U.S. is in a place where it's trying to do its best to either contain the fragmentation that's happening in the global order or to redefine it. And how do you really do that? And how do you really form an international coalition if you don't have a set of values that you can at least speak to? It's become more difficult because of the Iraq invasion and the cynicism that caused. But that was sort of my, I wasn't really good at articulating what I meant by shared values, but that's where I see the relevance of that today.
I think Putin kind of rode to the rescue, didn't he, by allowing you to all coalesce about our good old-fashioned values. And in that sense, yes, how else can we explain this support for Ukraine? It's overwhelming, and it's done in the right spirit. It's the right thing to do for sure. But of course, it doesn't escape people living in Turkey or elsewhere that this happens when it concerns people who are in Europe, who are white, who are Christian.
Is that, you think that this has to do with skin color, the invasion of Ukraine?
I don't, but I'm saying that's the perception. Where were the values when Assad was barrel bombing Syrians or gassing them?
Isn't there a bigger security threat to Europe with Russia invading Ukraine than there was with Assad?
Yeah, exactly. So it's about, what matters to you most.
Sure.
Well, as I was saying with Turkey, I think Ukraine's another example where, no U.S. policymakers and commentators are never more excited than when values and interests seem to line up so perfectly. And I think that's what always made Turkey a feel-good story in the past. And it's what makes people, what makes Ukraine such an easy thing to focus on now is that they genuinely do line up. I mean, it's not in any way being cynical about that as it comes to Ukraine, but just it's convenient to seize on these moments when everything is operating in lockstep.
So let's talk a little. Let's at least touch on the elections. What I did not want to do, and this is why we're recording this a day after the runoff election. I didn't want to contribute to like the whole media circus around the first round and what happened, and I really wanted to try and make this conversation about what does this mean going forward and why does it matter and why should anyone care. But let's at least touch on what happened for people that either aren't familiar or need an update. First of all, Erdogan won the runoff. So that's kind of common knowledge at this point. What were the main issues that people voted on in this election?
Nick?
You have been following
well,
this than I have. I would defer to you on this one.
Well, obviously there were several issues, but it boiled down to what Erdogan wanted to make the issue, and he made it one of, typical sort of identity politics. If I go, Muslims will be forced to uncover their heads again. If I go, there'll be gay marriages. He went, not him, but his lieutenants went as far as to suggest that if the opposition won, humans would be mating with animals. This kind of thing, and obviously bringing in the Kurdish issue and painting the opposition as enablers of this terrorist group, as the PKK is labeled, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, and sort of using images of the opposition candidates superimposed on these guerrilla leaders, claiming that they were actually meeting and plotting, and this would be a huge disaster for Turkish national security, and obviously also pulling in all the sort of prejudice about the United States, the usual narratives about how these powers are out to undermine Turkey and undo all the sort of good that Erdogan's done, and how he's elevated the country, made it so powerful and, so muscular, and everybody fears Turkey, etc. So yeah, that was kind of what it was about, when in fact it should have really been about the pocketbook issues. The Turkish economy is an absolute disaster. People can't afford onions, garlics, it's that bad. So that speaks to, well, first of all, how good Erdogan is. He's a master at spinning these narratives. He's probably the best politician that Turkey's seen in its modern times. And that's why he's been around for over 20 years, uncontested, but also speaks to how poorly the opposition performed ultimately. It's not just that Erdogan controls the media, that, he controls the judiciary. True, it's not a level playing field, but equally, I think the opposition proved itself to be extremely incompetent yet again.
Do you guys think that there is almost like a sort of international appeal that populism and populist figures and sort of demagoguery has taken on, and also jingoism in the world today? And if that's true, how would you explain that? Because just to point it out here, what you're saying is that these culture war issues and the appeals to nationalism, which is runs very deep in Turkish society, and as you said earlier, Amberin, that in fact Erdogan is oftentimes responding to what his opposition is doing, pushing him further to the right on those issues. The fact that these dominated the conversation and not the economic questions, besides the fact that Erdogan is very, very skillful, and the fact that he controls so much of the media, or he has so much influence over it, how much of this is just some broader appeal that's happening internationally that we still don't really understand the sources of?
I mean, it certainly does seem to be something that's happening internationally. The similarities, as people have been pointing out for a while now, right, between the way these kinds of political appeals work in countries around the world really is striking. I haven't heard a particularly good, and it'd be fair to say, nationalism's been a big thing for a century or two now. It's not like that appeal has ever disappeared. Identity politics, religion has certainly been something that's, even as we talk about how Western Europe or the United States has become more secular over the last couple of centuries, religion still has a big appeal to people. So I don't want to exaggerate how new any of this is. But as you say, I mean, it certainly does seem like the last decade or so, these themes, similar combinations of these themes, have had a very striking resonance in very different countries, countries with different religions, countries with different histories, countries with different relationships to, the West, to, political and military power. And I can rehash the explanations other people have given, which all seem, relatively plausible. After the Cold War, kind of left-right economic debates didn't resonate with people as much. And amongst dramatic shifts in society, appeals to kind of traditional values had a newfound resonance for people. That certainly seems plausible. The internet has brought out a lot of negative things in a lot of negative places, made it easier to for people to segment themselves into smaller or more niche political communities. All of that seems plausible to me, but I can't give
It does seem like yeah, I just did an episode. Actually, I should also mention, because we've mentioned now Syria, we've mentioned I mentioned that I was here in Greece. We've done two episodes with Joshua Landis, one dedicated to Syria, one where we touched on it, and another one with Jake Hanrahan on Syria, and one with Ryan Selkis on the Eastern Mediterranean and Turkey, Greece, and also one with Soner Çaptay on Erdogan. So people are interested. It does seem, but I just did a recent episode with Tara Isabella Burton on her book, Strange Rights, which is about the rise of new religious movements in America and self-made. And it does seem like there's a kind of vacuum of values and identity in the world. And in that place where we don't really, we're not so clear on the story that we tell ourselves about who we are and what we believe and what we care about. And in those types of vacuums, there are opportunities for this kind of messaging to resonate with people, maybe because of a sense of rudderlessness around what are we in this thing together for? Is that something you guys ever think about? Does that resonate?
Yes and no. I mean, it's a neat way of describing what's happening in places like the United States, in Britain here, where I am with Brexit, Turkey, obviously. We just saw your election in Greece. Yeah, but ultimately every country, every society is different. And so I just don't think that in Turkey's case, it tells the whole story. Absolutely not.
So, Nicholas, if you have anything to add, go ahead. And then I want to ask you guys about the Turkey's economy and the state of that economy, because that's something that was, again, not as powerful an issue in determining the outcome of this election, but it's one that's going to linger on after going forward now that Erdogan's elected. And there's a lot of questions about whether he's going to use this mandate to reverse some of his policies like Xi Jinping did with zero COVID, or if he's going to double down, especially in light of the fact that we have local elections coming up in, not even a year. So feel free to respond to that. And then let's talk about the economy.
No, I mean, I'll quickly give, this is more of a non-response than a response. I mean, looking around the world today, I completely agree with you. I mean, it does seem like a lack of strong, ideological contenders that appeal to people, that give them some sense of meaning, is a big part of what's happening. But then when you look back at history, I mean, at every age, it does seem like at every step, people are wrestling with that. And so I guess that it just reframes the mystery of why this particular set of answers is having an appeal now. And at every stage, there was that sense of rudderlessness. At every stage, people put forward a set of answers that were supposed to fulfill that, channel that sense of meaninglessness into political direction. I guess that's for centuries now, none of them have quite done the trick. And so we keep trying new options. In this, we're in a new phase of it, clearly, but what explains the particular appeal of the particular things that are trying to answer that question now? I wish I had a better answer.
So I mentioned Turkey's economy. What is the economic situation in Turkey right now? Which one of you would like to tackle that first?
Well, I always hated writing about economics, even though I was the economist correspondent for 16 years. But I mean, in a nutshell, the situation is pretty bad, and there are several reasons for it. But the one that could be fixed is Erdogan and his obsession with low interest rates. And that's cited as one of the reasons that the Turkish lira has, been bleeding so massively over the past few years. And whether he will revert to economic orthodoxy or not. Obviously, the rule of law is an important part of this story, because, when Turkey seemed like it was on the right path, you had masses of foreign investment coming in, and that's all gone now. And of course, you have very high inflation, and you have a huge current account deficit. And the country is burning through all of its reserves to keep maintaining, the lira where it is. And I think it's already looking very, very difficult. And as you pointed out, given that we have these local elections looming in March, and that Erdogan is determined to get back Istanbul, which is so key to sustaining his own rule, because that's where all the rent is dispersed. That's where the contractors are given their juicy contracts, and it's a key component pillar of his regime. It's hard to envision that he would revert to economic orthodoxy, though we hear rumors that he's trying to woo back his former finance minister, this guy who used to work in London as a banker, Mehmet Şimşek, and who was sort of the last, the last defense against the crazy economics, and who was basically fired because, wasn't doing Erdogan's bidding. He's now apparently being wooed back, and I guess if he agrees, I think it would be mad for him to do that. But if he does, I guess that's sort of supposed to signal at some level that, guys, we're going to do that. Maybe not as fast as you want us to, but guys, we're moving in that direction. I just don't know. But obviously, everyone's talked about the big bust. For years now, I've heard about the big bust, how the Turkish economy is going to crash. And it hasn't. And there was a really great piece in the Financial Times. I haven't memorized it, but basically explaining why the fundamentals are still quite resilient in Turkey, unlike places like Brazil. So it's allowed the Turkish economy to sort of, not collapse in the way people have been predicting for so long. It does caveat that, saying, though, if he persists in this course, we may actually see some kind of
balance of payments crisis. What can you clarify what you said about his wanting to retake control, political control, through his party of Istanbul, which is the big metropolis in Turkey, and that would incentivize him not to return to orthodox economic policies? Can you explain that to me? Because aren't the people living in Istanbul the ones that are that most strongly support returning to getting inflation down and returning to more orthodox economic policies? So explain that for me.
Well, if you keep pumping subsidies and you bump up people's salaries, as he was doing in the run-up to these elections, there are tons of people in Istanbul who would respond, favorably to what he's doing. Don't forget that a lot of those people in Istanbul who live in these sort of towns that have, emerged around in the periphery of Istanbul, that are considered now as part of Istanbul, are people who came from rural areas, and who the AKP network very instantly, plugged into and helped. That explains the rise of Erdogan, of the AKP. Those are the people who actually support Erdogan. And I don't quite know what you mean when you say that these are the people who, want to see a return to economic orthodoxy. I'm not sure that's true. Just because the opposition won that election in 2019 doesn't mean that that's what was informing their choice. I think the crucial factor there was the Kurds who, were being very ideological, actually, by responding to their party's call to back the opposition candidate. And it was all about protecting their own interests as Kurds and pursuing their own very narrow agenda of Kurdish rights. And so they will be key in these local elections, again, just because of, the numbers, the demographics. And so the very interesting question then that poses itself is, what will Erdogan do to get those Kurds on his side? Because he's done everything to alienate them so far, and premised on the fact that nationally they don't matter as much. And that's what we've seen play out in this last election. Nationalism is the winning card, nationalism with big dollops of Islam. And so this will be very interesting. And this is a worry, in fact, because it also suggests that there'll be a lot more repression of the Kurdish party, of Kurdish actors. So we'll see how that goes.
So, sticking on this conversation about the economy, one of the things that I don't understand is how Erdogan has managed to, or the mechanisms through which he's been able to stimulate the economy. How much of this has been direct stimulus, like fiscal, and how much of it has gone through the banking system? And how exposed is the Turkish banking system to a rising interest rate environment if the Turkish government were to try to reverse these policies? In other words, how exposed are they to loans issued during this period of time where money was cheap?
My understanding of economics is sufficiently primitive. I am not going to weigh in on this
We
topic.
have you. We
other
have you
than
here
to-
for the geopolitics, Nick. What about you,
I was going to
Amberin?
say, if you thought I was going to talk about economics, you were mistaken. But no, I mean, it looks bad. That's my having talked to people who do know a hell of a lot more about economics than I do. That's certainly, you know,
Yeah.
they've been sounding the alarm for a long time. That it's never quite, as Umberton said, gotten as catastrophic as people predicted. That does seem to be because the government's been very good at figuring out ways to avoid the kind of catastrophe that's been prophesied. But then, people do say all of those measures come at a cost and simply increase the risk that when things go wrong, they will go very, very wrong.
Hmm.
I
Yeah,
guess I'd also add
I'm not going to go ahead.
No. I mean, I just because we were talking about the authoritarianism versus democracy and how that relates to interests versus values. What's so striking to me is that international investors clearly aren't ideological about things. They don't care if a country's democratic or authoritarian. If an authoritarian government is in place that's running the economy well, international investors are usually happy with that. The problem with authoritarianism is you don't always know what you're going to get, and if you get an authoritarian leader like Erdogan, who has very particular destructive ideas about how to run the economy, well, they're the authoritarians, and no one can actually push them, stop them from going on the course that they want to go, even as that drives the country into the ground. And so I think part of it, even when you're talking about Erdogan trying to bring back someone like Mehmet Şimşek, who would have a lot of credibility, who clearly knows how to run an economy well, the fear is that even if Erdogan brought him back, if Erdogan didn't let him do what he thought he needed to do, again, it's going to be Erdogan's call to make. It's not like he's going to give him, defer to him necessarily. And so I just, at that level, the political structures that are in place in Turkey aren't conducive.
Wasn't
to
his
having-
son-in-law the finance minister, or was he the foreign minister?
Yes.
Finance
Erdogan-
minister, and
Finance,
he's
there you
the
go.
one who burned through all of the reserves trying to prop up the lira.
Yeah, so I was going to say, Nicholas, before I started to interrupt you, I'm not going to ask you about the special savings accounts and how those work and whether or not the Turkish government has the ability to make good on those claims in the event of a balance of payments crisis, which is it's a weird thing that people would, but I don't know how the government's been selling it, so I won't ask you about that. So another question that I had, I mean, we kind of started to talk about this, but I had a set of questions about it because it's always interested me to understand to what degree the saber rattling that goes on in Turkish politics, to what degree that is simply just signaling as part of the culture war, and to what degree it represents real ambitious foreign policy objectives. We've talked about like strategic autonomy. We didn't talk in this episode about Mavi Vatan or the Blue Homeland, but that's also part of this. There's a deep literature of sort of geopolitical knowledge in Turkey that influences the foreign policy debate. To what degree are these going to be lasting issues that Turkey is going to try to implement as part of a revisionist history of its borders? Do either of you have thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I was just in Syria and I had very clear and present thoughts about that. It's very obvious to me that with this government, we're certainly going to continue to see Turkey flexing its muscles beyond its own borders. It's doing that in Syria, where there's a relentless campaign against the Kurdish-led administration there. They haven't been able to mount another large-scale invasion because basically the Russians didn't let them. But that's not to say that Turkey does not continually mount artillery strikes, drone strikes, that is really, wearing at the fabric of that sort of self-administration there and causing harm to civilian infrastructure, killing civilians, and making life generally very difficult. And the same goes for northern Iraq, where Turkey is also, fighting the PKK and has been expanding its military presence very steadily. More and more encroachment you see of Iraqi Kurdistan, where you now have Turkish troops fanned across the length of that border. And of course, that's very concerning to the central government of Iraq. It's a sovereignty issue. Yet, despite all these calls that they keep making on Turkey to withdraw, Turkey is not, and there's no power around to make them withdraw. I mentioned earlier on about what happened in Azerbaijan and Karabakh. Again, another manifestation of Turkey, matching its words with real action. And having just been in Armenia, well, just a couple of months ago, again, there, the fear was that Turkey would be helping Azerbaijan now claim a land that would allow Azerbaijan to connect its enclave, Nakhchivan, that borders Turkey, with the with Azerbaijan proper. It's to many Armenians, that's a very clear and present danger, threat. And I'm sure sitting where you are in Athens, in Greece, people do worry. And of course, the future of Cyprus, I'd love to hear what Nick thinks, how long it's going to take before Turkey actually formally annexes Northern Cyprus.
Nick, I want you to answer that. Let me just add that, well, let me ask it as a question. Am I wrong to distinguish, because I do, to distinguish between Rojava, northern Syria, and northern Iraq, and the Eastern Mediterranean, because the first one represents a potential security threat for Turkey. The Kurds have always been an issue, and so that seems, I can justify the concerns there. The rhetoric around the Eastern Mediterranean feels much more about ambition and about territorial expansion and reworking borders than it does about addressing security concerns. Is that, would you agree with that, Amberin? And Nick, feel free to respond.
Yeah, I absolutely do agree with that. But I would also contest the justification on the grounds that certainly in the case of Rojava, that it poses a security threat. I understand, sitting in Ankara, it is very disconcerting to see your NATO ally, the United States, arming, training, living cheek and jowl with people who had senior positions inside the PKK and who ostensibly were in the field targeting Turkish soldiers, yes. But as things currently stand, Rojava is a different theater. Their target is not Turkey. They have not attacked Turkey. They've held defensive positions by and large and have spent a lot of their human capital, in fact, fending against jihadi groups that have been empowered, enabled, armed by Turkey. And jihadi groups, Islamic State, Jabhat al-Nusra, now Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which claims to be not anti-American anymore, but yeah, who have threatened, Europe, have gone and struck the heart of Europe.
Nick?
What strikes me about Erdogan's aggressive rhetoric, be it directed against Kurds in Syria or against Greece, is that people always try to parse it, or at least in Washington, people sometimes try to parse it as, is this for domestic consumption or is this real? And what always strikes me is, look, I think Erdogan genuinely thinks this aggressive approach to the world is good for Turkey's strategic interests, and it's clearly good for him domestically. I don't think he necessarily sees it as a choice. And that's alarming to the extent, clearly given recent Turkish history, it makes more sense with all the caveats that Amberin added, why the focus on Kurds in Syria is much more real, or should be much more real to people in Ankara. But I don't know, given the way U.S.-Greek relations have developed recently, what worries me is that I do think Turkey has kind of started to see the U.S.-Greek relationship in the same terms that it sees the U.S. relationship with Kurdish fighters in Syria, that there really is this deep-seated belief in Ankara that the U.S. is conspiring with Turkey's enemies to try to, at the very least, contain Turkey, maybe bring Turkey down, destroy it, dismember it, topple Erdogan. And that, was clearly manifested for people in Ankara in the relationship with the Syrian Kurds. But again, you have the cyclical, self-perpetuating thing, whereas U.S.-Turkish relations get worse, U.S.-Greek relations have gotten better. That seems to be a good thing for the United States and for Athens. But, obviously the threat perception in Ankara, especially when people there kind of very much downplay Turkey's own role in making and driving this dynamic, is that they see the U.S. and Greece getting closer. The U.S. is developing a base in Alexandroupolis, which from Washington's perspective is clearly aimed at more effectively transporting supplies into Eastern Europe, into Ukraine, especially given that they're not sure what their access through the Bosporus is going to be like. But Turkey somehow sees this as a NATO base on Turkey's border that's going to be used to attack Turkey. Now, you can say that's crazy given that the United States already has bases within Turkey, but that threat perception seems to be real in Ankara, and that's dangerous.
Amber, and I see you nodding away while Nicholas was
Yeah,
talking.
I'm nodding away because I also think it's important to note that Erdogan does believe firmly that the Obama administration had a finger in that coup attempt against him.
Did the Obama administration have a finger, do you think?
I'll let Nick answer that. He's sitting in DC.
No, I could confidently say the United States did not. What I would say, and this is, as I said, I studied Cold War history, so I have to give this the little background. The obsession in Turkey is that the United States was actively involved in sponsoring all of the coups that ever took place in Turkish history, even somehow the ones that were against U.S. interest. And again, I wonder if you do Cold War history, you're like, yeah, the United States sponsored a lot of coups in the 50s in particular, and so it's not crazy for people to think that. Again, in the case of Turkey, since throughout most of the Cold War, either government that was in power was usually, especially at the beginning of the Cold War, pretty pro-American. The United States didn't actually have any reason to try to topple any of them. So in that sense, again, not out of commitment to democratic values, but for much more realist reasons, it wasn't like the United States had to have coups in Turkey. I'm not saying they wouldn't have if they had to. But the damning fact, and this is where, again, the Obama administration was not involved in the most recent coup attempt in Turkey, full stop. The United States has worked every time there's been a coup in Turkey. The United States has very quickly begun working very closely with the military government that came in power through the coup. So while I think the conspiratorial belief that the United States was behind the scenes orchestrating these coups is false, the cynicism that history has created, if the coup against Erdogan had succeeded, would the United States have maybe waited a couple days to be polite and then sat down with the new military regime to talk about how they were going to coordinate against ISIS? Of course they would have. So in that sense, I want to push back very firmly against the conspiratorial side of this, but also say I understand where the cynicism is coming from.
So guys, I'm going to move the rest of our conversation onto the premium feed. I would like to explore what the next 5 years have in store. What version of Erdogan do you guys think we're going to get? What is his playbook going to be? And what is that going to mean for the future of Turkey and U.S.-Turkish relations? And then also, I'd like to the extent that we have the time to do this, discuss what the U.S. can do at this point. First of all, what is America's approach right now to this part of the world? And what can the U.S. do, if anything, to rehabilitate its image? Because Amberin brought this up a number of times. Of course, we have the invasion of Iraq. That was a huge turning point in U.S. relations, and it really created an environment. It embedded a sense of cynicism around U.S. foreign policy, and when we talk about values, and it undermined the international institutions that now we supposedly lament losing. So that's what we're going to talk about in the second part of this conversation. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second part of today's conversation, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and sign up to one of our 3 content tiers. All subscribers gain access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the rest of today's conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. Amberin, Nick, stick around. We're going to move the rest of our conversation onto the premium feed.